And the elections in Gaza and the West Bank are upcoming October 8th. We will, of course, keep following them here. Shaiba Nuri, thank you very much for joining me for this. We are staying in these parts, and Israel has reportedly agreed to hand over the bodies of 7 Palestinians from East Jerusalem who were killed in confrontations with Israeli forces. According to the Palestinian Prisoner Administration, police officials have agreed to transfer the remains held for months under pressure from Israel's High Court. Meanwhile, the Israeli security services maintain that it does not want funerals to be used as a pretext for incitement and further violence. Here's more from Gabrielle Weiniger.
It was a bloody day in October with triple attacks in Jerusalem and central Israel. One of them, a deadly knife attack on Jerusalem's 78 bus line. The attacker, Baha Elayan, was shot dead at the scene. His family home in the city's east was raided and demolished a few weeks later. But Elayan still hasn't been buried. His body is being held by Israeli authorities in a refrigerator in Jaffa's mortuary, 10 months and counting. He's one of at least 7 attackers or alleged attackers from Jerusalem being held, despite a Supreme Court ruling in May that called for all bodies to be returned before the start of Ramadan in June. Israel says bodies will be released once the families sign a list of preconditions, including a burial in a police-allocated cemetery and a limited funeral size. The families say the process is a long and expensive one, but it's one that may happen in the coming weeks. Israel has approved the release of those Palestinians one by one, starting at 1:00 a.m. on Thursday.
And with me now in studio, our senior analyst for Haaretz, Amir Oren. Amir, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Ayman.
And our journalist and the author of the report we just saw, Gabrielle Weiniger. Gabrielle, good afternoon. Now, Amir, let me start with you and a quote that I found very interesting. The Prisoners Club chairman, Kadura Faris, told the Jerusalem Post, I quote, "Why does Israel have to withhold someone's body after he has been killed? I do not think a dead body forms a security concern. Why does Israel maintain these bodies?"
Well, obviously, Kadura Faris is right. And one should not try to analyze it coolly and rationally, because it is not. There are 2 very vague explanations, and they are not very convincing either. One is that the deterrence value of any measure in this wave of terror is doubtful, but nevertheless one should put the extra weight on deterrence. And if there are families whose son is going to be a shaheed and whose body is going to be withheld from them, and they would plead with him, please do not go and commit any offense because we will not get your body, perhaps this will help. Again, not very convincing. And the other factor is that the funerals of the deceased are themselves cause for riots. So these are the explanations used by the Ministry of Internal Security, because basically it's a domestic political issue. Some politicians from right-wing parties, in this case the Likud, want their audience to applaud them for being emotionally active. But again, Kadura Faris is right. There is no value, and Israel should hold the high moral ground rather than haggle over bodies.
But it's not the only deterrent that they're using. They're also destroying the homes of those families of attackers, and such measures may be all on top of each other. Israel is then saying, you know, will be a deterrent in some way.
And well, Amir, you mentioned Israeli members of the Likud party. We should mention, Gabrielle, that Gilad Erdan, the minister, had previously frozen a decision by the Israeli government to return the bodies that was granted in May. Now he's part of the group facilitating this process.
That's right. So the High Court of Justice, based on a petition by the families of these slain Palestinians, said these Palestinians must be returned by June. Gilad Ardan, the security minister, then went on to say one body was returned. He said it caused too much incitement and they retracted that. But then once again, the High Court of Justice said the state has to explain by August the 15th why this is not happening, why the bodies of at least 7 Palestinians are not being returned. This is why perhaps we are seeing this decision today that they're going to release these bodies one by one starting Thursday morning at 1 a.m. at this very early, inconvenient time in order to prevent people from coming to the funeral. They're going to limit the numbers of people. Up to 25 people are allowed to come to this funeral. It won't be held in the villages. It will be held in a police cemetery, a cemetery chosen by the police. All these limits, again, are deterrents on top of the other deterrents that we've seen, such as the housing demolitions.
And there were funerals held at night, specifically because of these concerns of shaheeds or martyrs, as you say, Amir. Now, can we understand the Israeli concern here of fearing the incitement in these funerals? It seems like this would be a factor that many would say this is a really concerning issue. It's right that Israel fears it.
It's a real concern, but again, it's not convincing because riots or demonstrations can be held because of anything. Even the withholding of these bodies can be a cause for a demonstration. Now, Israel doesn't want these demonstrations to take place because it fears that they will become lethal. There would be more casualties on the Palestinian side and then more funerals. It will escalate. And while this is an operational consideration, nevertheless, morally, a state should not hold the bodies even of those who murdered its own citizens. It should not hold them in escrow.
And of course, Gabriel, this continues to be a painful issue for the Palestinian side, taking a look at the other side of this debate.
That's right. The families say they cannot mourn. I mean, it's almost coming up to a year that some of these alleged attackers have been held right here in Jaffa in a forensic institute where there have indeed been protests against the fact that they're being held for so long. The families say they cannot move on. They also go through very costly legal expenditures to go through these, to get back the bodies. They have a long process to do it. It drags out the mourning process. Adamir and Adala both condemn the practices. These are 2 Palestinian legal rights organizations. They say that many have been extrajudicially executed by Israeli forces. Not all of them are attackers. They say this is an unfair and unjust policy by Israel.
Well, one shouldn't mix the issues. If people were executed, then it's murder, and we see right now at least one soldier who has been indicted and is standing trial on such charges. But one cannot sympathize with the families, even though they are grieving, they want to mourn. This is another issue.
But the families are not the attackers.
Yes, yes.
Do you hold Charles Manson's family responsible?
The Israeli public is not going to sympathize with the legal costs that the families have to go through when they appeal to the High Court. The Israeli civilians feel that they are under attack, and they are not going to feel any sympathy towards the families of those who attack them. Nevertheless, it is not going to deter anyone from further attacks. It is only going to escalate. So being rational and operational means that Israel should stop this disgraceful practice.
So you would say the families of attackers don't have a right to mourn immediately?
They do have a right to mourn, but the Israeli public is not going to sympathize with the emotional strain that the families of those who murdered Israelis are going through. These are 2 separate issues.
So it's a measure, in fact, to appease the Israeli public, perhaps, and not to deter other future attackers?
Of course, it's domestic. All I'm saying is that returning the body immediately is one thing, and asking for the sympathy from the Israeli public is something else altogether, and it is not going to happen, much as the Palestinian public does not empathize or sympathize with Israeli casualties.
Well,